trade is always, and free trade agreements are always difficult to sell domestically in whichever politics of whichever the country. But the job of national political leadership and international leadership is frankly to take a long-term view of this. And this will remove restrictions in so many categories of trade across both economies, not just agriculture, not just manufacturing, but most critically the burgeoning area of the services trade, that we will see both economies benefit from this. So I congratulate both political heads, both Mr Abbott in Australia and Xi Jinping from China, for reaching an outcome.
Yeah, but listening to Australian radio this morning, people are calling in and saying we're really worried about things like food prices going up, that the manufacturing sector is going to be hit by this as well. It doesn't seem like ordinary Australians are remotely convinced by this deal.
Well, it takes a while for these things to work their way through. It is the easiest thing in the world is to run fear agendas against free trade agreements. But this particular bilateral free trade agreement, which my predecessor John Howard worked on, I have worked on as Prime Minister, and Mr Abbott has brought to conclusion, has been the product of bipartisan work over a long period of time. And its conclusion will benefit our economy. It's already a $150 billion two-way trade relationship. That's just the beginning. The other half, which we're barely talking about so far, is what will happen in the investment relationship. And there, I think, we'll see a deep transformation of the overall economic relationship.
Well, there are worries there too about that investment. And you must have to reassure people all the time on this one, that Australians worry that China is buying up Australia and that, frankly, the tariffs are off the table now because China already owns so many Australian farms, Australian businesses as well. Of course, they want the tariffs off.
Well, I think we just need a few facts in the equation here. Number one, when it comes to agriculture, there are still significant restrictions in terms of open slather with Chinese investment into Australian farms and the approval mechanisms necessary. For the general economy, we've applied to the Chinese the same standards that we've applied to foreign investment from other advanced economies, including the United States, through our free trade agreement with them nearly a decade ago. Australians at various times in history, like anyone else, has been concerned about one wave of foreign investment after another. Initially, they worried about the Brits buying up the Australian pastoral industry. Then it was the Americans buying out the Australian auto industry. Then it was the Japanese buying out everything. And now it's the Chinese. So let me tell you, our country, 23 million people occupying that vast continent, through our entire economic history, we've relied upon large transfers of foreign investment capital in order to grow the economy, and this is just the latest chapter in a very long book.
But Australians have just seen with this deal now the threshold go up to over $1 billion Australian dollars that can be invested by the Chinese without there needing to be any kind of rubber stamping by the government. I mean, don't you think that's going to potentially feed into that worry that some Australians have about how the Chinese are coming in and buying up large parts of the country?
But if this was unique, then yes. But we did do a free trade agreement with the United States only a few years ago, which instituted precisely the same number. So a dollar of US investment is somehow better or worse than a dollar of Chinese foreign direct investment. That's not our view. And the other thing to bear in mind is, given the significant size of the state-owned enterprise sector in China, is that the government has still maintained the existing regulations pertaining to direct investments into Australia by Chinese SOEs. So if you look at the whole package, on the trade side, the investment side, I think this is genuinely win-win for both sides. There'll be bumps in the road, there always are, but together with a growth message out of the G20 summit just held in my own hometown of Brisbane, I've got to say these are good messages for growth in a growth-challenged world, and you've seen the data from Japan already today.
China, though, was very keen to say this relationship between Australia and China is not just about trade. President Xi addressed the Parliament in Canberra and he said there was a strategic vision that he believes that both countries share. So he's looking at some kind of political partnership here, not just an economic one. But how do you begin to even square the fact that strategically both countries are quite different? We're talking about a country with a democracy and a country with a one-party system, a different kind of belief in human rights. How does Australia say it actually can share that strategic vision when actually things are very fundamentally different?
You know something, Australia is not Robinson Crusoe either in the region or in the world on this. China is vastly different to practically every other country in Asia. Its neighbours in South Korea and Japan are democracies and open economies. Now, they have some cultural commonalities with Chinese Confucian traditions. Then you go to Southeast Asia, where you see robust democracies in the Philippines and Indonesia and other parts of Southeast Asia. all these countries face this challenge of an open economic relationship, a strong political relationship, and areas of security policy cooperation where we have real interests in common.
So you think that strategically the two countries can be aligned despite the fact that they are so different?
You know something, since one of my Labor predecessors, Edward Gough Whitlam, recognised China back in 1972, we have managed in the nearly half century since then to walk gum and to walk and chew gum at the same time. And so that is, we make no apologies for our alliance with the United States. We work with the US closely around the world, but that is not to the exclusion of other close relationships in Asia, including with this emerging megapower called China.
But isn't it interesting, you're talking about chewing gum and the relationship with America, and it seems to the rest of the world that President Xi is just not so delicately encouraging Australia to move away from that close relationship with the US and to forge a new sort of regional partnership with China instead.
Look, as Prime Minister, I had many conversations with Xi Jinping and over a number of years. Xi Jinping has a vision for his own country, which he describes as the China dream. The Chinese word is 中国梦. What I find interesting in this last visit and his address to the Australian Parliament, he's now talking about a dream for the region. I'm all for people having a vision for wider East Asia, which is about how we cooperate in security policy terms, rather than simply submit ourselves to the inevitable trajectory of history, that when you have rising powers like China and established great powers like the United States, that it's all going to end in tears as it has for the last 2,000 years. I'm all for actually learning from history. So when he talks about his dream or vision for Asia, I believe that's something we and our American allies can work with. Building a sense of common security in East Asia, common economy, and using some institutions to take the edges off all the historical problems which exist as well.
There is still a very definite choice that Australia has to make at the moment, because you've got America pivoting towards Asia, offering their own trade agreement that they want that excludes China, and then you've got China's idea of this whole region having, you know, no borders in terms of trade. Australia's going to have to make a choice, isn't it, about which way it goes, with America or with China?
No, I think we have managed to keep this balance under control for the last 50. I think we can do it for the next 50 as well. And our friends in Beijing, with whom we have a very frank relationship, understand how far these things can go, and we're not about to turn away from our American friends and allies. Our Chinese friends also understand that when Australia had its backs to the wall in 1941 with the Japanese invasion, that we turned to America, and America got us out of a whole lot of trouble, and that has a deep impression in the minds of Australians.
Do you spend quite a bit of your time now convincing people that it's not about the differences between Australians or Americans and the Chinese, but actually the things that unite the countries and unite people, the common elements?
Well, you know, I've spent the last year at the Harvard Kennedy School working on one project, which is Alternative Futures for US-China Relations. It's my first time living in America. I've lived much longer in China over the years, actually, so it's a bit of an experience. But the bottom line is this: we can talk all day and all night about how these two societies, the US and the Americans, the US, the Americans, and the Chinese on the other side,
and the Australians, would you include
and the rest of, let's call it the collective West, where they have differences and disagreements. Okay, we can just keep writing that list. It's a harder list to write, and where there are in fact common interests and common values. And there's a third list too, which is areas where you could develop common interests. What I'm actually advocating with our American friends and partners, and I think President Obama did well in his most recent visit to Beijing and his bilaterals with President Xi Jinping, is a realist relationship which recognises where there are strategic disagreements, like in the East China Sea, the South China Sea, and other general strategic matters, where there are areas of constructive engagement, for example, on cyber terrorism, for example, on militant jihadism, in areas such as North Korea, in areas such as how do we avoid maritime clashes at sea and crisis management, and how do we build the common economies of the region. So if you have a relationship which is both constructive about where you have common interests and values, realist about where frankly they're just too hard to reach commonality within the foreseeable future, but with a common vision, let's have a region which preserves the peace. We don't want to repeat the mistakes of Europe.
Okay. Can I, before you go, ask you to address this tricky question of what's happening in terms of the Accords on Climate? Because how damaging do you think it is for Australia that at a time when we see this historic deal signed between President Obama and Xi Jinping on climate change and tackling climate change, we see Australia repealing their carbon tax?
Well, I think the bottom line is this. In the move from where we were at Copenhagen 5 years ago, and I still have all the scar tissue from that, having been in the room with 20 leaders from around the world, trying to hammer through a Copenhagen declaration, to where we are now, where China and America are now agreeing on significant carbon reduction targets out to 2030. And we look forward to the Paris summit coming up in December next year. I think we are now in a positive slipstream. There are going to be countries, and not just Australia, but Canada and a few others, who are going to be, shall we say, less enthusiastic about the trajectory. But in the global scheme of things, who are the big emitters? Number one, the United States. Number two, the Europeans, and over and above them all now, the Chinese as the world's largest emitters. If you get those three lined up, which for the first time in the history of climate change negotiations we are starting to see, then I think when I look to the challenges for President Hollande and Foreign Ministers Fabius and their team in Paris next December, for the first time, I'm feeling modestly, just modestly optimistic that we might be able to pull off something for the planet. And, you know, we'll bring the Australians along as well.